Anyway, I'll begin this paper. So, Caribbean Contacts, New York Networks. What did I actually call it? 1905 to 1927. It actually goes into the 60s, so the dates have changed. Anyway, by the turn of the 20th century, significant numbers of Caribbean immigrants had arrived in New York. Of the 102,000 that entered the US between 1901 and 1924, the vast majority came from the British Caribbean and settled in New York. Whether these migrants, being highly adapted to peripatetic networks, as critics such as Winston James has observed, saw New York as a permanent home or just an extension of a migratory network, is perhaps rhetorical. Nonetheless, these migrants altered the landscape and societal makeup of New York City considerably. Indeed, studies suggest that around 1/5 of black residents in New York hailed from the Caribbean around the teens and the 20s. The introduction of, in 1924 you get the introduction of the Immigration Act, which basically halts emigration of Caribbean migrants into New York, into the US generally. But by this point, we could argue that New York could be said to be in part a Caribbean metropolis, truly incorporated into the peripatetic network of the diaspora. So the influx of Caribbean migrants roughly coincides with one of the most significant cultural movements led predominantly by African-American writers. I use African-American in the continental sense, so across the whole continent, who lived, worked, frequented or intersected the milieu of Harlem. While literary criticism generally refers to the movement as the Harlem Renaissance, it is a contested term, with critics divided over the validity of its usage, its periodization, and its geography. And in the course of this paper, I wish to dwell on the ways in which the term or the typical delineation of the Harlem Renaissance might be helpfully problematized, particularly in relation to Caribbean writing to emerge from New York in the first part of the 20th century. So firstly, in terms of the name, it must be borne in mind that the Harlem Renaissance, like titles of so many movements, came after the event. The original terms, the New Negro movement or the Negro Renaissance, which were used not always interchangeably, undoubtedly faded as the term Negro became anachronistic. Secondly, critics of the term have questioned the extent to which a Renaissance took place. So was there a rebirth? And also how much of the literary production was dependent on Harlem? Arguably there were other spaces, both within New York, or places I should say, and other places within the US that also contributed to this kind of modernist African-American movement. So while undoubtedly a significant modernist African-American-led literature emerged with Harlem as a key locus of production and literary networking, some of the most incisive criticism draws attention to the international character of the movement. So hence Paris might well be thought as another kind of key metropolitan network linked through writers associated with the movement who resided there for a period, such as Claude McKay, County Cullen and Richard Wright. Alternatively, the movement could be seen as having a broad international or regional scope in that many of its writers were from the Caribbean and brought with them a Caribbean hemispheric or global perspective to a broad range of issues. Thirdly, periodization of the Harlem Renaissance is often delineated as beginning around the First World War and petering out somewhere in the Great Depression around the mid-1930s. While acknowledging the elasticity of the movement's timeline, George Hutchinson, in his introduction to the Cambridge Companion to the Harlem Renaissance, writes that the, quote, period 1918 to 1937, unquote, could be said to reasonably encompass the era of Renaissance writing. So in one study by Arthur P. Davis and Michael Peploe, the upper and lower limits of the Renaissance are stretched to 1910 and 1940 respectively, though notably the Harlem tag is dropped in favour of the original term, the New Negro Renaissance. So clearly there's no consensus then on definitive dates. In part, one might well argue as there is no consensus as to the writers which comprise the Renaissance specifically. Cheryl A. Wall has drawn attention to the secondary role that women have been afforded in studies of the movement. So in approaching the corpus of Caribbean writing that emerges from New York in the early 20th century, it may well be worth paying heed then to the thorny issues of terminology, geography and periodization, all of which could be contested if simply aligned with the typical paradigms of the Harlem Renaissance. I've put a note to go on to slide 2. So I'm interested in this group. They're predominantly Anglophone writers. Some of them have a second language as well, often Spanish or French. So this group includes Jamaican authors and activist Joel A. Rogers, up there on the top left, W.A. Domingo, Claude McKay, Marcus Garvey, Amy Ashwood Garvey, Amy Jacks Garvey, the Virgin Island journalists Hubert Harrison and Frank R. Coswaith, Novician playwright Uali Spence and journalist Cyril Briggs, Barbadian journalist Richard B. Moore, Puerto Rican lay historian and bibliophile Arthur Schomburg. And I was recently up at the Schomburg Center in New York, which is named after him, and bought a lot of his collection. The Montserratian journalist Hodge Kernan, the Guyanese writer Eric Walrand, Trinidadian activist George Padmore and Claudia Jones, and the communist couple Otto and Hermina Housewood, born in Suriname and British Guyana, respectively. I could even add C.L.R. James to the list. I'm sort of playing around with whether he quite fits in with the group. He'd be a kind of slightly later figure that I could include. So the vast majority of these Caribbean writers were drawn to leftist and black radical politics, often operating within or shifting between socialist, communist and black radical circles. As writers and political activists seeking economic and career opportunities beyond their homelands, some came to settle in New York, while some moved to other cities in the US, and others were far more peripatetic, migrating across the globe. So my point here is not everyone settled in New York for a serious period of time, but certainly New York is one place in which there's social contact or literary production, something like that. So often their US citizenship was uncertain or obtained rather late in their lives, making their position in the US tenuous, especially when politically outspoken. Their radical activism caused friction with the US authorities, leading to government surveillance and deportations, famously in the case of Garvey, and later Claudia Jones, as well as causing complication in terms of re-entry to the US, as was the case with Domingo, who was seen as being a bit too red. Anyway, like I am today. Anyway, taken as a whole, the group's writing could be said to span 1903, which is much earlier than studies typically kind of date the Harlem Renaissance, when Harrison's first letter was published in the New York Times, to 1965, the date of Rogers' last publication. For the most part, the writing roughly falls into the following genres: journalism, short story, novel, poetry, political tract, history, biography, essay, and letter. And there are some occasional forays into experimental or rather unusual genres. And I'll give you an example of that in a minute from J.A. Rogers' works. So J.A. Rogers' debut 1970 work, From Superman to Man, it's ostensibly a novel, but it borrows heavily from the dialogue, which traditionally explores a philosophical topic from the point of view of often two or maybe a few more speakers. Rogers' autobiographical experiences as a porter undoubtedly colour the portrayal of the main character, a black porter named Dixon, who ultimately convinces a senator from the South that there is no foundation to his hitherto racist beliefs, hence reducing the Superman to a man, as the title indicates. But it's quite a curious sort of, if it is a novel, it's quite a curious novel, is what I'm trying to say. And the other thing that Rogers did was an illustrated column called Your History in the Pittsburgh Courier. And you can see it here. It was published as a 1940 collection in book form. And it's perhaps the first and only kind of graphic non-fiction I've come across from this group. In fact, I don't really know of graphic non-fiction in this period, so maybe if anyone does know about it, you could tell me about it at the end of this paper. Geographically anyway, Harlem clearly served as an important hub for meetings, particularly from the late teens onwards. Significant sites included the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, where Harrison led Liberty League meetings, and the United Negro Improvement Association's headquarters, and Liberty Hall, where Garvey led his campaigns. Eric Walrand offers this romanticized snapshot of the neighborhood. It's very lyrical. Is that it? Yeah. So north of 125th Street. Ooh. Sorry, this is my own. I'm disrupting my own talk here. Sorry about this. There's a lesson to me to switch my phone off. Anyway, so north of 125th Street and glowing at the foot of Spuyten de Ville is the sweltering city of Harlem, the black belt of Greater New York. With Negroes residing on Sandwell Hill on the east side in Greenwich Village, Harlem undoubtedly is a seething spot of the darker races of the world. So is Harlem, with its 185,000 beings, the melting pot of the darker races. Here one is able to distinguish the blending of prodigal sons and daughters of Africa and Polynesia and the sun-drenched shores of the Caribbean, of peasant folk from Georgia and Alabama and the marshlands of Florida and Louisiana. I think it's interesting because here he's sort of blending all of these sort of tropical places into a kind of melting pot in Harlem. So we've got Africa, Polynesia, the Caribbean, and even within the US, those places that are further down south, so perhaps semi-tropical, Georgia, Alabama, the marshlands of Florida, Louisiana. So there's almost a suggestion then that perhaps, I mean, his description here, certainly within the Americas, is almost like an extended Caribbean, which could extend into the southern United States as well. Anyway, I won't go on about that. So, yeah, interestingly, Walrond also locates areas outside of Harlem in which the settlement of African Americans and African Caribbeans was prevalent. So I was interested in just sort of mapping interesting places of meeting places, lyceums where people met up, and you can see Harlem's up here, but there's a number of kind of interesting pinpoints which suggest there are places of social meeting and gatherings outside of Harlem which are significant. So in particular you get the East Side, you get Greenwich Village, most of the liberal places in New York, and the San Juan Hill district, the latter reputedly deriving its name from the veterans of the all-black 10th Cavalry who fought in Cuba in the Spanish-American War. So even San Juan Hill has a kind of Caribbean resonance to me anyway. Greenwich Village was another key area with the office of the Liberator on 138 West 13th Street, where Mackay worked as an editor for Max Eastman, serving as an unofficial meeting place as well for Afro-Caribbean radicals like Domingo, Harrison and Hoosewood, as well as for the underground organisation, the African Blood Brotherhood, founded by Cyril Briggs. They're a very curious organisation anyway. They have these secret meetings in the building, which is quite exciting. Anyway, for me. San Juan Hill, resonant with US-Caribbean relations, was another important location for these Caribbean writers. And it was a formative place for several Afro-Caribbean intellectuals, including Hubert Harrison, who's one of the earliest writers in this group to make his mark, to which I'll now turn my focus for the remainder of the discussion. Interesting, when I was up in New York, I went to the Columbia University Library Archives and I managed to find out some juicy gossip between Harrison and Garvey. And Harrison would later petition for Garvey to be deported. And there's lots of clippings because Garvey has problems divorcing his first wife, and she actually doesn't want to divorce him, takes him to court. But Harrison is called up because it seems as if he's having an affair well, he is having an affair. But he's kept all the newspaper clippings, and these are all in Columbia University's archives. So I was just going through this, going, wow, he really, wanted a record of this. Anyway, so Harrison is a figure who perhaps best challenges the typical delineation of the Harlem Renaissance. And he also stands as one of the most underrepresented writers in studies of the movement. Recounting his early years in New York in his autobiography, A Long Way From Home, Claude McKay describes Harrison as the one black intellectual in New York with whom he was acquainted. Harrison, in McKay's words, was a lecturer on the sidewalks of Harlem and Wall Street. Quote, the black hope of the socialists, unquote, prior to his membership of Garvey's Pan-African movement. Like many who were attracted to Garvey's movement, Harrison would later fall out with Garvey. Harlem could have fallen out with Garvey, but we'll talk about that in another sentence. Anyway, eventually, yes, Harrison, as I mentioned, would call for his deportation alongside others in the Messenger. Nevertheless, he has been credited by both observers at the time and subsequent critics as having led and paved the way for Garvey and the new Negro militants of the era. Harrison's subsequent neglect by future generations as an activist, and particularly as a writer from a literary point of view, no doubt stems from, in part, as Arthur Schomburg phrased it, the fact that Harrison was, quote, ahead of his time, unquote. That he was a soapbox orator, essayist and journalist primarily, though he occasionally produced poems, may also count against his remembrance in literary studies. And I think a number of us who worked when I was on the previous project, The American Tropics, often were talking about the fact that novelists and poets, but particularly those who produce novels, tend to kind of get remembered more than those who don't. So being a journalist, it's sort of a borderline territory for remembrance, perhaps. Anyway, so born in, I want to say St. Croix, but I gather you guys say St. Croix. Yep. So, that's right. So born in St. Croix in 1882, Harrison emigrated to Lower Manhattan in 1900, residing at his sister's place on 220 West 62nd Street in the San Juan Hill District. It was here that Harrison began to attend the lyceums of two West 53rd churches, St. Benedict's and St. Mary's, an experience that afforded him the opportunity to test his oratory skills and meet Afro-Caribbean and African-American intellectuals. At St. Benedict's, he formed close bonds with Arthur Schomburg, the African-American lay historian Johnny Bruce, and Samuel Duncan, who would become a future UNIA president after Garvey, and who was originally from St. Kitts. Harrison's movements are in some respects representative of the black community in New York at the start of the 20th century. Just as New York's black population began to move northward, so Harrison would follow suit, moving to Harlem, a neighborhood in which he would reside more and less until his death. Here, Harrison built up his reputation as a formidable street speaker. After losing a lucrative job with the post office, partly because he had a bit of a sparring with Booker T. Washington's friends, he became particularly active in the Socialist Party and rose to become one of the most prominent black members and the first to actively assess the relationship between the black diaspora and the party. Indeed, it was his criticism of racism within the Socialist Party ranks that led to his disillusionment with the party and to his eventual split with it. These tensions between leftist party politics and race consciousness foreshadow the actions of Harrison's successors. So Richard B. Moore, like Harrison, broke from the Socialist Party, would later be expelled from the Communist Party, as would Cyril Briggs, both on account of their sustained emphasis on black nationalism or black issues. And you also get a foreshadowing of that with Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison, and I think Ralph Ellison probably covers that best in Invisible Man. In 1916, Harrison commenced a series of lectures in Harlem's Lafayette Hall and launched the new Negro manhood movement. It is a term he used interchangeably with the New Negro movement by 1917, when he found the Liberty League and the League's official newspaper, The Voice. The League's venue for public talks was the Harlem's Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, and its inaugural meeting included among its speakers a relatively unknown printer from Jamaica by the name of Marcus Garvey. According to The Voice, the Liberty League and the new Negro movement represented a breaking away of the Negro masses from the grip of the old-time leaders. This is significant as the term New Negro is so closely associated with Alan Locke's 1925 collection of the same title, and the subsequent term, the Harlem Renaissance, it's often kind of subsumed or forgotten or obscures, rather, Harrison's earlier usage of the term in his political writing. So in his wide-ranging essay on the New Negro, and I'm kind of moving towards the close, Henry Louis Gates Jr. traces the term's history back to its origins in 1895. Gates is keen to highlight the term's appropriation by Locke, who he sees as depoliticising its usage by black socialists like A. Philip Randolph and W. A. Domingo in literary circles. Curiously, however, no mention is made of Harrison, the very man who Domingo credited as leading New York's black radicals. Furthermore, Gates, while apparently sympathetic to the artistic impulse, ultimately judges the literary contribution to the arts in this period as steeped in failure, in contrast to the blues and jazz of the era. And I mean, the long quote there, he's basically takes this stance that it was not as successful. So claiming that the new Negro movement had realised an unprecedented level of Negro self-expression, it created a body of literature that even the most optimistic among us find wanting when compared to the blues and jazz compositions, blah, 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 blah. So I contest this, basically. So what Gates appears to overlook is the overlap in literary endeavours. So Harrison, Domingo, Briggs, Rogers and others were all arguably literary in their pursuits, and their writing could not be simply supplanted by Locke's. Domingo, in fact, contributed to Locke's 1925 collection, while Harrison wrote numerous articles about the theatre, novels, and literature generally, as well as composing his own poetry, perhaps the most radical being one that's entitled The Black Man's Burden, which is a play on Kipling's poem and a kind of response back to Kipling. I won't read that one out, but you can have a look at it. So indeed, Harrison's commentary on the Renaissance in black literature may explain his omission from some literary studies of the Harlem Renaissance, as in one article he contested the notion of a rebirth of African American writing, asserting that a kind of cultural amnesia effaced a, quote, stream of literary and artistic productions which have flowed uninterrupted from Negro writers from 1850, unquote. That such criticism, however antithetical it seems to the notion of the Renaissance, is often omitted from studies of the movement seems particularly short-sighted. Furthermore, the attenuation of literary as only related to the often more established US figures of Locke, Du Bois and Washington seems to remove or overlook a significant overlap between the literary and the political in this period, an overlap well covered by a black radical New York set whose predominant origins were Caribbean. Okay, there you go, thank you.
So you're taking on Gates, huh?
Yeah, I'm taking them on.
Love it.
Just a comment, Jack, about the importance of your work for its importance as a hybrid, or recognizing, I think, the hybridization of what we call African American studies that's not looked at continentally, or including the Caribbean and Caribbean literature, because when we teach the Harlem Renaissance, it's not with this Caribbeanist bent, and I think that's really important work for helping us think more expansively about black studies, about African American lit, about Caribbean lit. So always this tussle about who you include and who you don't, and thinking also about genres. So not just literary in the traditional sense, but also journalists, the work that they did.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is partly what prompted me to kind of launch into this project. Is you're going beyond a kind of purely nationalistic take on literature. So, if you're within kind of US literary studies, then you might feel that this is a bit marginal. But once you start looking at it from a different perspective, it might be African American studies in some broader sense, but again, it's traditionally sometimes can be rather US centric. And I think the interesting thing again that I was thinking about was, say after the 1924 Immigration Act, where suddenly you get a kind of clamping down on immigration to New York. If you've already got a fifth of the population hailing from the Caribbean, then the second and third generation suddenly just become African American and US born. And you do get a blended, populace there. But I would still argue that there's some interesting kind of relationship going on. And there are all sorts of figures. Du Bois has Caribbean heritage. James Weldon Johnson has Caribbean heritage. It's just not, it's a few generations back. So I think certainly I'm interested in studies that go beyond national boundaries, or sometimes contained within. I mean, this is both kind of contained within and broad, and New York is such a migrant city, so I'm sure another study could be done with, you know, some other immigrant or emigrant group. Yeah, and in terms of the genres, both when I was doing my PhD on this American Tropics project, we were all kind of pushing to include, particularly because many of us are interested in the Caribbean, and the Caribbean writers have produced many odd genres. I think journalism is one of those interesting areas that is both literary but is often studied by cultural historians, sometimes geographers, sometimes literary people, and it's somehow the novel and the poem tends to become the thing that makes people or allows them to be remembered. And perhaps, I mean, the really curious one is, you know, Joel Rogers' graphic history, and he was a historian as well. Some quite radical stuff in his graphic history. A lot of it is kind of slightly didactic, did you know that, you know, I don't know, the first person to invent this was a black person, and he, you know, blah, 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 blah. That kind of narrative is going on in his graphic history, but there's a desire to educate and take pride in things that were kind of buried beneath the surface there. So, yeah.
So are critics, are you going to be interested in trying to distinguish between or among threads or themes of people from the Spanish or the French and the British Caribbean? Is there some point in trying to distinguish among those three types of kind of imperial colonized people in New York?
Well, Peter Hume, who was my dissertation supervisor, and I worked with, he was the PI on the American Tropics project. So he's interested at the moment in Hispanophone writers here in New York, sort of across Latin America and the Caribbean, and we've talked about a potential collaboration. We're kind of doing similar things around the same time, so we haven't had a strict collaboration on this. But we've sort of shared material and talked about related people. And Arthur Schomburg is one of you do get people who are, you know, crossover. Schomburg is from Puerto Rico, is you know, Hispanic, Spanophone as well as Anglophone, you know, writes in English and writes in Spanish. So at the moment, we're not necessarily talking about turning this into a huge project, but I mean, you will get Caribbeanists who will pick perhaps their language area, and so, you know, the Francophone or the Hispanophone or Anglophone. You know, I tend to stick to Anglophone, but I may branch into the odd other areas. But anyway, does that answer you?
Yeah, it does.
Are you curious at all about looking inside the Caribbean to see what kinds of literary influences were happening there? So I think like later periods about a Césaire, for example, who was really influenced by Southern writers, and particularly the work of the Civil Rights Movement, a later period, and that helped him kind of produce A Tempest, because we're working in Shakespeare's The Tempest.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, I'm just thinking about this, but I mean, if the future project is potentially a book, I might want to think, is this going to be a chapter, and then how do I connect those chapters? So maybe I'm basically interested in US and Caribbean kind of relationships at the moment. So yeah, I would be interested in those in the Caribbean who are kind of interested in what's going on in perhaps the US South or the US generally. So. And yeah, there's Edward Glisson talks a lot about Faulkner, and he feels that Faulkner is somehow connected to a Caribbean consciousness and stuff. So I am interested in that kind of material. And New Orleans is another interesting place to me, which I see as a kind of Caribbean city. You've got Mardi Gras, and a lot of people left the Caribbean and settled in New Orleans anyway. So.
I have a quick question about the illustrated history. You mentioned also that it had a didactic flavor to it.
Mm-hmm.
Is the audience primarily adults, or did that have a broader audience?
Yeah, I mean, I'm wondering if it was partly I mean, I'm guessing adults bought the Pittsburgh Courier, but I'm wondering if the hope was that it would be disseminated to black families and given to children, and look, we can take pride. I think there's always been that problematic thing historically for African Americans in the broad sense that, who are role models? So it does seem to be a sort of there's an educational impulse behind it, because I would find it curious reading it, but again, I mean, maybe again it was seen as still adults, I'm guessing, would have still perhaps read it and found it interesting, and I find it, curiously interesting from a researcher's point of view. So, it'd be interesting to sort of find out more about it, really.
Okay. I think you'd have to look at the paper. A lot of the papers back then had sort of children's pages or half pages, and sometimes you see things like this. I've run across them in the early, turn of the century papers, and a lot of times it was graphic, but not about this topic.
Yeah.
It was other things.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that it seems to be a sort of educational impulse.
It's
So
fascinating that early. I've never seen anything quite that early. It's cool.
I realize that your study is historical, but I'm wondering if you have any comments or thoughts about the ways in which these authors in this period have been picked up or influenced contemporary figures.
Yeah, well, it's. I mean, this is the hard thing that I would struggle with, I guess, because a lot of these figures are. I mean, Claude McKay is probably the most well known of the group, and his sort of protest poetry sort of made a name for itself. So, If We Must Die, apparently may have been read by Churchill around the Second World War to rally the troops. Apparently may have been read, I think, in fact, to Congress to get it's rumour. We're not entirely sure. It possibly was read in the Attica riots in the Attica prison. If We Must Die, but he's the most well known. Hubert Harrison, the biographer of Hubert Harrison, basically got Jeffrey Clark, I think it is. He did his degree at Columbia, and he's quite an activist now. I think a union activist, and I might get to meet him. He thinks that basically Harrison is a precursor to people like Malcolm X. He sees Harrison as being much more radical than Martin Luther King. Harrison kind of advocates self-defense. Harrison is a head of Garvey, so his biographer certainly sees him as a precursor, and sort of as early as 1910 or something, to stuff that was going on in the 60s, which I think is pretty interesting. And then where does that take us? Does that influence Ferguson? I don't know. But he strikes me as a really interesting figure, and someone who's of interest to both a historian, a political scientist, a literary person, as much as any other.
Thank you.
Sorry. Yep.
I noticed on your image of all the writers that you were interested in your larger project, there were a number of women writers, and I'm just wondering, sort of how did they fit in? Did they have particular interest in gender or not at all?
I mean, at the moment, this is just a bit of a survey, so I haven't looked at every single writer in as much detail as I have Harrison or McKay, so I know those two pretty well. So Claudia Jones is an interesting one. So she moves to the US when she's quite young, and she's writing kind of politically kind of leftist stuff in as a journalist, and is pretty much in the milieu. I'm not so sure about. Again, I haven't done enough research on her yet to sort of find out what she's saying about women. But there tends to be a kind of an alliance. I mean. Harrison, for example, talks on. He's sort of demoted by the Socialist Party at one point. He has to talk on the women's issue, but he goes for this with aplomb, which is almost really identical to something that happens in Invisible Man again. So there is there does seem to be an alliance between gender issues, as women being potentially oppressed by men, African Americans facing oppression. So there is a sort of alliance, and I'm guessing. that Claudia Jones would have been fairly kind of responsive, I'm guessing. But yeah, I need to do more research on some of the female figures. And Eualie Spence, as well as someone, I really don't know enough about her, so I should just...
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear about your future plans. I know you're planning to return to New York at the end of term, and
Yeah.
you've alluded to meeting some people. Are there some other primary sources that you're trying to chase down?
Yeah, well, I managed to meet Brent Edwards, who's a researcher in Columbia University, who has done a lot of work around the Harlem Renaissance and actually has discovered a new novel by Claude McKay that was found in the Columbia Library archives. It was in the wrong person's box. This guy called Samuel Roth, who was quite a curious journalist, and his PhD researcher found it in this box and said, Brent, I think this might be an interesting manuscript. It might be by someone else. Might be by Claude McKay. So Gates, who I'm criticising, and the PhD researcher are collaborating on getting this book out. And it's in the archive. I can look at it. I don't think I'll have enough time. I could just take pictures of the whole manuscript. I might just wait for it to. They've written their introduction. It's ready to go to press. But apparently the hard thing is, it's hard finding who the owners of the McKay estate is. So for the librarians here, I don't know. That might be a tricky issue. So they're all ready to go, and Brent's just sort of scratching his head. So when I go back basically to New York, he's going to arrange for me to have a sort of longer, like an entry card, whatever, for the library, because you can only stay for 5 days in one whole semester, so I've pretty much used that up. But if you have a sponsor, they can get you a month's pass. So he's going to do that. I'm going to try and speak to the biographer of Harrison, who Brent knows. I don't know, he's a union activist, so he sounds like an interesting guy, but he's an independent scholar. So, and I'm kind of curious to meet those sorts of people, because these are marginal figures who don't necessarily get taken up by more mainstream writers. So that's the New York side of things. When I get back to the UK, I'll probably have a very heavy teaching load, but I will try and sort of follow up on this project. Again, I'm not sure whether this will be part of a book, whether this is a chapter, or whether, I mean, this whole thing could be a book just looking at Harlem. I mean, there's certainly enough material here, but I might want to move to other places and have kind of US Caribbean links and, move to other spots of connection. Yeah.
Could you contextualize this poem again in the way you're using it? I sort of lost that part.
Yeah, well, I was just alluding to. I didn't really analyse this poem in any great detail or anything, but I was just talking about the fact that Harrison is a literary person and that Gates doesn't even kind of acknowledge him. And most of this material gets published in kind of journalistic. He must be aware of Harrison, but I find it an odd omission, and the fact that this stuff was, he didn't have poetry collections like Claude McKay. He wasn't necessarily a recognised poet. So this stuff being serialised in sort of a journalistic form, but still there. And I think the fact that this is, he's just incredibly radical and incredibly literary. It's just, so I wasn't really kind of, and I think it's one of the first responses possibly to Kipling. I mean, when is this?
No, H.T. Johnson responded first to Kipling. He wrote the first Black Man's Burden. So I was wondering if you're interested in intertextuality. H.T. Johnson, who was a black clergyman in the U.S., he was interested in like American interventionism, so American colonialism. And so, that would be an interesting, of course, that was more like in the Philippines context, but you could still kind of argue like Americans sort of interested in, or whites and Western culture interested in like the Caribbean and the islands and sort of the tropics.
Uh-huh.
So, I don't know, I think that might be, I found it really interesting because it actually proves that he was a very literary person because he probably knew about this
Uh-huh.
kind of
Uh-huh.
history of retorts to Kipling's
Yeah.
poem.
Who was that figure again?
H.T. Johnson,
H.T. Johnson.
1899, I think, was the
Oh, okay, yeah, that.
first black retort.
Okay, well that does predate this then, I think, but it is, you know, it's just curious that he gets kind of ignored, and perhaps, I mean, I don't know if he's been put in discussion with H.G. Johnson.
I have no idea. Yeah, I don't.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, really, all I was kind of doing with this talk is kind of giving you a survey and a taster of a lot of people who somehow get left out of the record. And really the project is to kind of actually do some of the research and find out more about some of this material. And I don't know if the huge list of people that I put up there, if I'm necessarily going to go into huge amounts of detail in every single case, but the fact is I'm just building a kind of map of people who aren't traditionally included, and then that extends dates. As I said, I mean, most people don't talk about the Harlem Renaissance starting until kind of the 1920s or just before. So if we're moving back to 1903 and we're perhaps looking at letters that get published in newspapers, then, and again, letters, you know, very important in perhaps the 18th century, but somehow in the 20th century less important, perhaps. But I'm questioning what gets included in a kind of literary genre. So, yeah.
So I'm interested in, I guess, in the relationship between the kind of study that you're doing
Mm-hmm.
of New York City, you know, 80 years ago, 100 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and very contemporary studies by, I guess I'm thinking about people like Dominic Thomas, Nikki Hitchcock, who do these kinds of studies of, say, Paris as an African city, Afro-European
Mm-hmm.
studies, mainly people from West Africa, former colonies in Paris, and there's a guy whose name escapes me who does this about London. It's like, you know, Afrique sur Seine or London on the Ganges or something. They do these kinds of, let's look at the culture of a city in relationship to its emigrants or migrant descendants. And it's just very interesting. I see the kind of study you're doing, but it's different. It's back in time, and yet you're doing this kind of multicultural, multifaceted study of a colonial or post-colonial or para-colonial city.
Yeah. I mean, I've met. I did this talk also. It was a version of this at a Caribbean Studies conference in Glasgow earlier this year, and there was someone who's pretty much interested in Paris as a kind of black city, and she sort of lit up when I mentioned Paris as an important site within, kind of with the Harlem Renaissance as well, because so many in that time zone, Richard Wright and various others, and Claude McKay,
Leopold
Senghor, yeah. I mean, so and I feel like there's quite a few critics who have looked at Paris as this kind of liberal black city. So I think that I'm doing sort of parallel work to that, and I call it, in the previous project we were on, we called this kind of literary geography, and it was moving towards both specificity, but not necessarily seeing that as giving us small answers to things, that we can still engage with broad topics by, as it were, being very specific.